233 3020 joint workshop. I mean, it's the first of its kind. I'm sure you guys must be happy to be, attending the same lecture as your tutors. I mean, you can equally say, look, man, we're ecos today, and it's quite nice. I mean, I would take, kicks from that. Anyway, just a few admin issues. So, it being a joint session, I have got 2 registers, so just complete the register which applies to you. So I've got 2003 as well as 3020. This is very important for monitoring evaluation purposes, so please ensure that you sign in the register and sign in the right register for that matter, and please don't sign for your friends because it actually distorts the results. But anyway, so like I mentioned, this is a first of its kind, and I'm sure you guys are quite familiar with this. I mean, it's with regards to the budget speech competition essay, and just to mention, for those of you that don't know me, perhaps you might be doing second year this year, but for those that were doing second year last year, perhaps we may have had some interaction during the workshops for 2003 as well as 2004. So just a few issues. These are my contact details. Whenever you've got a problem, just email me, as long as it's a problem relating to school, of course. Feel free to email me, and of course I respond to emails quite promptly. And I'm mostly found in the writing hub, but I usually do not entertain drop-by visits. I always prefer to work with an appointment because that keeps my schedule in line. So yeah, those are my contact details. Anyway, you don't really need to take them down because these slides will be up later on today. Yeah. So an important thing I wish to stress is this disclaimer here. We had a case last year where a lot of people cited my slides. And of course, it was quite nice for me. It was like a month of fame, Bewe 2015, and I enjoyed it. It was fun. It was fun. But when you look at academic writing is all about using original and authoritative sources. So in this case, the material I'm going to present here may have been paraphrased from an article I may have read, from a report, etc., etc. So what this material is here to do today is just to guide you, to stimulate the way you think about things, all right? It's not for you to copy, right? But it's to stimulate how to begin to think about the essay, and which is the important thing here. You're not here to just copy down what's there and just write and pass, though. It's to stimulate the way you think, to be able to apply yourself, using real world problems, all right? So, of course, what we generally do in these workshops is, I'm sure you were told, we'll have workshop 1, we'll have workshop 2, all right? So what I've done here, I've got an outline of what we will cover in workshop 1. And of course, this being workshop 1. I'll do workshop 2 next week, Thursday, and the repeat of workshop 2 the following week, that other week on the 24th, all right? So in workshop 1 today, what we what we will look at is the learning outcomes. Of course, as you may know, we've got 2 classes in here, but at the end of the day, we expect slightly different essays in terms of critical thinking. So we expect more from the third-year students as opposed to the second-year students. I will talk more about that when I get to learning outcomes. And of course, an important thing is before you write any essay, you need to be able to understand what is the topic? What does the topic require you to do? What does it not require you to do? Remember, this is a 2,000-word essay, and it's a think piece. It's more or less, it's concise and to the point. There's no room for waffling. Should you choose to waffle, that might act as a decreasing factor towards your marks because you might not have any substantial points to validate your argument, okay? But then what I've also chosen to do in this case is I've created some form of a structure just to get you thinking on how you should approach the introduction. What are some of the important issues that need to be in the introduction? And of course, I'll talk about what needs to be in the main body, of course, which is the main part of the essay, right? But an important thing which I'll also talk about is conclusions and recommendations, right? Before, you may have written a whole lot of essays and you may have had recommendations before conclusions, right? But in this case, it's more or less of a task where you're asked to identify the challenges of the education system in South Africa, right? After that, you're expected to make recommendation. So in other words, your recommendations are supposed to come right after your conclusions. Just please take note of this. Recommendations come after the conclusion because you can only recommend that which you have concluded, all right? And of course, when making those recommendations, they need to be based on what you have concluded. So you cannot make a recommendation that does not appear anywhere in your text, okay? So in the second workshop, of course, I'll do a recap of workshop 1 just to bring us up to speed, get some flavor of what we may have done this week. But then we'll go ahead to look at how to conduct policy analysis, which is very, very important in this case, because remember, you're trying to analyze, look at, what have been the failures of the education system in South Africa, because the intervention has been, government has been spending money. According to education, in the economics of education, once you increase spending on education, you expect access and quality to increase. But this has not been the case in South Africa. So in other words, you're evaluating a policy to some extent, right? You're identifying those challenges and making recommendations based on that. And of course, like I mentioned, we've got different levels here. And of course, at the third year level, we would expect students to actually introduce some graphs in their essay. Hence, I've got a section there that says potential sources of data. It would be nice to have some graphs, showing perhaps tracking the education to GDP ratio of South Africa, in comparison. Anyway, we'll talk about most of these things as we go ahead. And I'll also look at the conclusions and recommendations in workshop 2, just to bring you up to speed to ensure that you guys understand what you're concluding and what recommendations you're making. All right? So, many of you will agree or attest to the fact that it's not in my position to ask you why you were doing this course, and in particular, why you're writing this essay. But of course, it's important for you to understand why you're doing this course or writing this essay, for you to be able to understand what is it that we expect of you. So at the second year level, you would find that we expect you to stimulate your ability to critically analyze problems, all right? And that's what we're looking for you to be able to identify problems beyond the noble man. But what is also important is we're looking for a hybrid, a mixture of economic theory as well as real-world applications. So it's hybrid, it's a mixture of the two. So you get to look at the theory that you've done in class and apply to real-world problems. I'm sure many of you might wonder and ask, how does this topic relate to economics? I will later explain how the topic at hand relates to economics. On the third year level, we expect advanced research skills, critical thinking, in-depth critical thinking, right? So we expect you to be able to make use of data, make use of graphs, all right? These graphs don't have to be identical, but as long as they apply or they conform to a priori expectation or economic theory, you can put a graph and support it. Remember, in economics, there's no right or wrong answer. There's only a good argument and a bad argument. So if you can argue a point quite well, that works in your favor, all right? So whatever graph you choose to put in your essay, it's fine, but as long as you can substantiate why you've got the graph there and what the graph is there to prove or to support, okay? So this, of course, brings us, having talked about all this, having spoken about, the learning outcomes, etc., it begs the question, where do we start from? Because this is a very critical question. In an essay, you've got, someone gives you an essay topic, and you've got, you face with the question, where do I begin? And the sooner you can answer this question, then you're good to go. And in this case, I think the best place to start would be the essay topic, trying to analyze the essay topic. If I may ask, how many of you have had a chance to read the essay topic? Just to read through, not to critically analyze. So of course, we've got a few hands. Well, it's not too bad. Yeah, we've got a few hands, but yeah. Anyway, for those of you that don't know what this topic is about, I'll just give you some flavor. So basically, what this topic is about is the South African education system. So what's been happening is government has been spending money on education. As I mentioned earlier on, standard educational economics theory states that once you increase spending on education, you would expect access to education to increase, you would expect the quality of education to increase. Of course, this is from a perfectly competitive market, right? Don't quote me wrong, it's from a perfect competitive market. But then what's been happening is government's spending all this money, but when you look at the output, you expect the quality of education to go up, you expect access to education to go up, but this has not been the case, right? This has not been the case, and this is where the biggest challenge is. And when you compare South Africa to some of its peers or to low-income developing countries, you find that South Africa spends more, but has got a poor education system, as opposed to other countries that spend relatively less as compared to South Africa, but have got a much better education system. A very good example in this case would be Zimbabwe, all right? So one of the fundamental questions here is, what are the challenges facing the education sector that weigh on education attainment, and how can they best be addressed to bring us in line with our peers, right? So immediately when you look at such a topic, it should begin to stimulate how you should analyze this topic. And in this case, just by looking at the essay topic, of course, we've got two questions that we need to begin to think about that are quite apparent to us already. And in this case, the first question, of course, is what are the challenges facing the education system that weigh on educational attainment? So when you look at the word education attainment, it's not a word that is known by a layman, all right? So in other words, in your essay, you need to define this word, right? You need to define what education attainment is. And I mean, of course, it would be nice to define education attainment right in the introduction, okay? Then the second question that comes to mind here is how can they best be addressed to bring us in line with our peers? This is a very, very interesting question. And of course, already when you read such a statement, it should tell you that the essay is asking you to make recommendation. So as I mentioned earlier on, first of all, you start by writing up your essay, then concluding. After making a conclusion, only then can you recommend. So make sure your recommendations come after conclusions, right? And so another issue, so sometimes when you read an essay topic, sometimes it's easy to draw, the main research question or the main aim of the essay just by looking at the topic itself. But sometimes when you look, you look into the essay topic, or rather you analyze it a little bit deeper, you find that there's more meaning than it appears. So in this case, we've got the simple word pupils, all right? So this is contained in the essay topic. So the word pupils already tells you you are focusing on high school as well as primary education and not university education, right? Because I mean, normally we refer to primary as well as high school kids as pupils, right? And in universities, normally students. So already, your initial disposition determines how you begin to progress with this essay. So in other words, you should more or less focus on basic education and not post-secondary education and training, okay? Is that clear? You guys seem worried. Is everything okay? Yeah, I know I don't really crack the funniest jokes. I'm not really a funny guy. But I do try sometimes, but yeah, I do try sometimes. Anyway, that was the joke, in fact. But anyway, so like I mentioned earlier on, pupils means you're focusing on high school kids as well as primary education. And of course, we've got another statement there that talks about how South Africa falls behind its peers. This already should begin to stimulate how you will start to compare South Africa's peers. South Africa to its peers, of course. You should be able to start thinking about how will I compare South Africa to its peers. And in this case, you want to look for an indicator. Is it going to be the teacher-to-learner ratio, all right? Because there are a lot of indicators. But at the end of the day, remember, you need to find an indicator that's, more logical and highly representative, all right? If you pick the teacher-to-learner ratio, is it significant as compared to the other country? I mean, if it differs by 1 or 2 pupils, I mean, there is a thin line. But one would, in this case, I mean, as the essay topic is highlighted, you'd consider to look at the level of spending on education, right? So you look at how much South Africa spends on education. But getting an absolute value, let's say, for instance, if South Africa spends a hypothetical figure, let's say 500 million on education, that does not tell us anything in cross-comparative analysis, right? It tells us nothing. It's just an absolute figure, right? But at the end of the day, if you maybe scale it, all right? You scale it by the GDP, and you get an education to GDP ratio. That is more representative, right? It tells us something. You can compare the percentage spent on education, as a ratio of GDP compared to another country, all right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Those are things you need to be able to think about. And one important thing, yet again, that the word pupil tells us is, as mentioned earlier on, the word pupil tells us a lot, in fact. So even when looking at the budget and trying to decompose the budget, right, trying to decompose the budget, because of course when you go to the budget, you're going to find the education section, right, which is quite cool. But then within the education section, remember, you've got tertiary education within that. So you need to be able to decompose that a bit further, because if you just pick the whole education budget and scale it by GDP, it doesn't really tell us a lot, because you also factoring in university education, because I mean, remember, government gets to fund universities. So when you go to the budget, decompose that further and look at the percentage of basic education to GDP. That makes more sense, all right? Because then you would have eliminated, university funding, okay? Yeah. So then, I mean, what we've done now is we've deconstructed the essay topic, and this is very important. I mean, it gives us a couple of questions to answer, and it gives us some sort of a frame in which we can work under, right? But then we need to begin to think about what do we need to have in an introduction, or rather, what would be fruitful? And one thing I forgot to mention in the disclaimer is what I also put down in the introduction there does not necessarily mean that is, what is supposed to be there. I mean, of course, it may be important given that it's there, but of course, we would require more research from you, for you to do some more analysis, get things that distinguish your essay from other people. Because, I mean, remember, we tend to mark quite a number of essays, and in this case, they'll be close to like 1,500. So, I mean, how do you give an essay 90 if they're all identical, all right? So there has to be a distinction, and how do you create that distinction is by carrying out in-depth research, right? Showing that you've got a good command of the material, and that's what is important, okay? Yeah. So now we dive into the part where we have to look at, what do we need in an introduction, what do we need in the main body, and of course, I did draw the distinction, especially in this essay, between the conclusion and the recommendations, and which one comes first, which one comes second. But of course, an important thing that we might need to do here in your introduction is perhaps try and look at the evolution of the South African education system. The evolution is very, very important, because you need to be able to understand, where does this problem stem from? Where does it come from? Right? That's a very important question you want to answer. That's a very important question you want to ask within your essay. Because, I mean, sometimes it's easy, especially when you're looking at policy and, policy analysis or evaluation, to be able to see where the problem is coming from. And, I mean, what has been done, right? What has been done to fix the problem? And an important aspect in this case is, it brings us to basically, the role of apartheid, on the education system. And of course, when you choose to think about this problem in much more detail, before 1994, you find that, well, there were very few schools that were fully funded, or that were funded very well by government, all right? And there were many schools that were, funded poorly by government. Already, in fact, not many people had a chance to go to school, and of course, especially the black populace during that time. And so post-1994, what government decided to do was to create policy and to create an intervention. What was this intervention? It involved increasing government spending, right? The essence of increasing government spending was to increase access to education. Because, I mean, already, if very few schools were properly funded or were fully funded during that time, I mean, you can even tell by the general pattern nowadays, you find that you still have very few schools that are doing exceptionally well. What does that tell you? That tells you already that a large number of the population actually go to these very poor schools. So these are schools we call previously historically advantaged schools versus historically disadvantaged schools, all right? So one issue you might want to look at there is what was the aim of government intervention? And it's, of course, the idea was to increase the rate of access. And when you go to the literature, you find that actually, I'm not quite sure about this, because I did read this. So I think by 2011, access to education had increased, and education attainment had gone up substantially to about like grade 9, average education attainment, something like that, yeah. But anyway, this is your homework. It's not for me to talk about, in greater detail. Yeah. So, and of course, this is what I just mentioned earlier on. We had highly unequal schools, right? There was a lot of inequality among the schools, and the basic idea was, to bridge the inequality between schools, bridge the inequality between historically disadvantaged schools and historically advantaged schools. But until today, that gap is still wide, all right? Because a whole lot of socio-economic factors have a role to play, all right? Because even the students, quite often than not, you find that students who attend, who go to the poor schools, are probably come from a very poor background. But of course, it's burden after burden. You come from a very poor background, you find that the social, economic factors at home are not favorable, right? So it's quite constraining. And remember, what you also need to think about is, in improving one's education, right? Increasing the budget on education does not necessarily mean everyone is going to do well at school, because a set of holistic factors drive educational attainment or the ability to achieve in school. Okay. So in this case, you might want to also think about, right? Answer the question: how has the intervention affected access to education? How has this affected the quality of education? Because of course, like I mentioned, the literature supports the fact that yes, we've had an increase in access to education, of course, but the biggest challenge remains the quality of education. Okay. And how do you measure quality becomes a very, very interesting case, right? So an interesting thing, yet again, that you need to begin to do is, that's in the essay topic. That's in the essay topic is an issue to do with, cross-comparing South Africa to its peers. But of course, in order to do this, you need to have a logical way to begin to think about things. You cannot just wake up and say, yeah, I'm going to compare South Africa and the United States. What's the rationale you're using? So of course, the first thing you might want to do is identify a country, all right? You're trying to identify a country which you're going to, compare South Africa to. But in identifying a country, it would only be logical to identify a country that's got similar socioeconomic characteristics as South Africa, okay? I find it flawed to go and identify the UK as a country you can compare South Africa to, okay? And someone asked a question on Tuesday. They said, well, what would you define as South Africa's peer? And he brought up an argument where he said, well, during the W. Bush, regime in the United States, they had a policy where, is it "Don't leave no child behind" policy, and the target was the target was generally the ghettos, right? So he said, well, can't I use, the U.S. as can't I use the U.S. On a comparative basis? And I said, well, it sounds like a good idea. At the end of the day, the only thing that's going to constrain you is the fact that you might not be able to get data on the budget. Because, when thinking about a country, it's important to know whether you're going to get the data or not. Because if you go to the US, if you try and focus on what happened during that time, and you look at the education budget, you find that you can't actually decompose it any further, because you find that both urban areas and rural areas are all intertwined. And that becomes a problem and makes your argument flawed, okay? So in this case, if you want to think about this, you might want to focus on perhaps Africa. And look, you're at liberty to pick either one country or more than one country. But I generally would advise you to pick, one country. Yeah, only makes sense. It's only 2,000 words. So, but then, for you to think about this, you might want to focus on either Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, and you might focus on SADC, in trying to narrow down which country you want to pick. But also remember, one tricky thing in the essay question is that, they're actually comparing South Africa to its peers, but peers with slightly lower income levels than South Africa. So in trying to do this, you want to pick a country that's got slightly lower income levels. And there's no better example than a good number of countries in Africa, except for Nigeria, of course, which has got a higher income level than South Africa. But if you can present your argument quite well, I don't see a problem there. So, this I did mention earlier on. Having picked a country, but how are you going to analyze that country? How are you going to make this cross-comparative analysis? That is the biggest question. What indicators are you going to use? Are you going to use the debt to GDP ratio? Are you going to use the education to GDP ratio? Are you going to use the literacy rate or average education attainment of other countries compared to SA? Are you going to use the learner to teacher ratio? That's entirely at your discretion. But of course, whatever you choose to use should make economic sense. So of course, an important thing now, and just to give some flavor on what I just talked about. So, in understanding the evolution of the South African education system, some of this material can actually come in the main body as well, and trying to make a very cohesive as well as coherent essay. It doesn't all have to fit in the introduction, because generally with these essays, I mean, we generally like to see close to like half a page of an introduction, then there and then you hear a thesis statement. It's nice, it's cool. It's really cool. And you see that, you're like, okay, you know what this student is talking about. I remember this one time I read an essay, and the thesis statement only came after 2 pages, you know. And I couldn't understand where the student was going, and the student was just waffling. It was really sad. It was really sad. It was really sad, you know, and I stepped out, because I mean, it's hard to grade such an essay. I stepped out and I'm like, oh, let me take a break. It took me about 3 hours to mark, and that essay was, yeah, it was quite bad. But I mean, sometimes it's really sad, like to fail someone. It's sad, yeah. It is sad. It's really sad. Yeah, I don't like failing people. Like if I'm marking an essay, it's not really cool. Yeah, 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 yeah. But anyway, so some of the issues that I've tried to do in this essay is, of course, like I mentioned, so one of the fundamental questions here is, what are the challenges facing the South African education system, all right? So, I mean, one way or the other, we expect this to be in your main body. This should be in your main body, all right? So what I've done there, I didn't find I was battling, trying to find a way on how to present this information to you without giving you answers, all right? I mean, that was quite a daunting task. So all I did was I spoke about, I just mentioned who are the stakeholders, just to be able to stimulate you thinking, in being able to identify where the challenges are actually coming from. So in this particular case, what I did here was, first of all, I tried to look at the socio-economic factors, which of course tend to affect, a lot of issues. And in this case, I factored these into schools, pupils, and the economy. So, I mean, in looking at these challenges, you can try and, look at what are the socio-economic constraints of schools. In this case, you're trying to look at, do schools have infrastructure, right? I mean, that's a very important issue. Do schools have infrastructure or not? And you can go ahead to look at the pupils. I mean, sometimes, like we mentioned earlier on, actually there's a study, there's actually a study in the United States that actually finds that students who actually have a family member that has been to university tend to fare much better than students who don't have a family member who has been to university. Hence, I'm sure most of you have come across the question when you're making an application. They normally ask, do you have a family member who has been to university? That's what that question is all about. Yeah. So studies have shown that if you've got a family member who's been to university, students tend to fare quite well. And there's another study in the US where they actually talk about if you can't read and write by the time you're in grade 3, then the chances of you making it to university are quite slim, or slim to none. Exciting, right? I mean, I work on the assumption most of you guys could read by grade 3, right? Yeah. Yeah. So another issue you might choose to look at in this context, the socioeconomic factors, you might want to focus on the economy, right? I mean, as you all know, South Africa, yeah, is well known for an equal distribution of income and wealth. Yeah, right? So that's one issue you might want to look at, because remember, inequality is it's got a huge bearing. And it tells you a lot of things. If a society is, unequal, say by 0.7, right? A ratio of 0.7, a Gini coefficient of 0.7, this tells you a lot. It tells you very few people are able to afford good quality education, right? Yeah. So, on the aspect of pupils, right? You might also want to look at, go a little deeper. Try and look at studies that have looked at the physiological needs of students. I mean, for those of you that have looked at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, probably you understand what I'm talking about. For those of you that don't, well, we got Google. You just go on Google and Google will tell you everything. Yeah. So this is basically on the socio-economic factors. It's self-explanatory. Then another issue that you might want to look at is teachers. Well, I say teachers. Well, these are some of the stakeholders within this entire process. So, teachers, yeah, One thing you might want to think about in South Africa is you might want to ask the question, is teaching paid skilled labor or a profession, right? Is it paid skilled labor or a profession? By this I mean a profession is where you have to go through some competency tests in order to become a professional in that field. For instance, becoming a chartered accountant, all right? Right, as opposed to paid skilled labor where we come to university and we sit down, get a degree after 4 years and leave the system and get a job and not be tested whether we do actually know what we're talking about. So I mean, this is a very interesting question because I mean you find that because government is pumping in money into the teaching profession, anyone who feels like who doesn't know what they want to do in life, and at home they're busy pressuring you, what do you want to study? You're like, no mom, I'm going to be a teacher, and you start teaching, and next thing they don't literally know what they're talking about, because remember it's two different things. To be able to comprehend the material, write an exam and pass an exam here, and to being able to deliver in class, it's two different things. Some people can really, I call it CPG, cram, pass and go. Some people can come cram some material and write and get 100%, but they literally know nothing of what they're talking about. So I mean, one thing you might want to think about, especially in your recommendations, is it a profession? Is it skilled? Is it paid skilled labor? If teaching was a profession, in some countries, for instance, in the United States, I think, do I have any American friends here? Yeah. Okay. If they're here, probably they're not. They're hiding. Okay. Anyway, so in the United States, you find that it's in certain states, it's treated as a profession, right? So a profession where teachers actually have to write tests. It's so cool, right? Like a teacher goes and writes tests. Because I mean, you find that around here, around here, a teacher sets an exam, or a teacher sets an exam, but they can't even answer their own paper. A study, yeah. They can't even answer their own paper, like, yeah. And I mean, a study also shows that in South Africa, teachers in grade 6, compared to 8 other countries which I choose not to mention now because it's part of your homework, suggest that grade 6 teachers actually know very little about mathematics, and yet grade 6 mathematics, and yet they're teaching that. That's very worrying. That's a huge concern. Yeah. So, and of course, some of the issues that you might want to look at as well is teacher absenteeism, right? Which is a very, very important factor. You might want to look at that. I mean, I remember in my country, I didn't have like an English teacher for 3 years. I know it's hectic. Yeah, like he was very lackadaisical. He would come to school, just chill, sit down, and drink coffee and go back home. Like for 3 years, grade 10 and 12. Yeah. 2012, I'm sure you're wondering, like, how this guy passing? Yes, I did pass my English, by the way. Yeah. Anyway, so it's things like that you need to be able to think about. And some of the questions you might want to ask is, of course, do we have the right quality of teachers? But I mean, remember, all these points I'm putting down here, you just cannot mention that in your essay and say we don't have the right quality of teachers, all right? You have to be able to quantify, not really quantify this, but support this with empirical evidence. Show me where it says in the literature. And of course, I mean, we've had, most of the markers have really interrogated this literature in greater detail. So please explain, where do you get this from? Which study says that? Okay? That would really be nice. And of course, another question you want to ask is, do we have enough teachers? All right? Do we have enough teachers? Very good question you want to ask. If we don't have enough teachers, why not? Why don't we have enough teachers? Another question you might want to ask it again is, do we have enough teachers in the rural areas? Or do we have teachers in the rural areas? I mean, that's a very interesting case because, remember, we're looking at previously advantaged schools as well as previously disadvantaged schools. But most of the previously disadvantaged schools are in rural areas. And remember, we've got more disadvantaged schools than advantaged schools, telling you that a good part of the population actually goes to the disadvantaged schools. But if these schools do not have teachers, then that presents that presents a huge problem. But then you also need to be able to understand why don't we have enough teachers? Rather, if we don't have enough teachers in the rural areas, what is the case? Is it an issue to do with salaries? Hence, I highlight the point. Is it because of poor salaries? How do these salaries compare? How do salaries in the rural areas compare to salaries in the urban areas? Are they the same? Are they not the same? Because, I mean, logically thinking, I would expect a salary, salaries in the rural areas to be slightly higher. I mean, imagine, I would call it a hardship allowance. I mean, imagine having to use a pit latrine, etc., etc. I mean, I would rather stay in the urban areas, but I mean, one needs to be able to be compensated for a hard life in the rural areas. Of course, so you try and look at things like that to support your point. Okay? Yeah. This is so cool. Exciting stuff, right? Yeah. So another issue you might want to look at yet again is the issue to do with government, of course. You might want to look at government. So government is one of the stakeholders in this case, in the sense that it funds most of these schools, right? But you might want to interrogate how government funds these schools. So remember, all the government does is just gives money to the school that has got a greater throughput, right? Or throughput rather than, actually not throughput, but yeah, perhaps you'd say that. Throughput in the sense that, the school that, moves pupils from one grade to another rapidly, right? So you find that in order to get money, schools always just push students from one grade to the other, one grade to the other. But remember, the reason you've got grades in an education system is to be able to assess the level of knowledge, all right? So, and knowledge is cumulative, right? So knowledge in grade one will be required in grade 2 to build on the knowledge that you ought to acquire in grade 2. But imagine a case where you just push students through and through and through and through and through and through, and now you find that, even for the student, it becomes quite a stressful thing because, you're in grade 5 and you literally know nothing, right? You literally know nothing, you can't comprehend the material. It's because, you've not been properly trained or you've been pushed to a grade which you cannot handle. And at the end of the day, you be busy getting what I call the 4 freedom fighters fighting for free food. F, 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 F. And it happens, all right? Not the F you guys are thinking about, but the F, 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 like F, the grade F. Yeah, that was a joke again. You guys didn't get it. Yeah. So you find that even frustrates students at the end of the day, all right? That frustrates students at the end of the day. And in fact, it also has some correlated effects where the upcoming, the young kids, who are a grade behind, see their seniors or people they aspire to be like, failing like that. It becomes very sad. It becomes very, very sad. Yeah. So that's government, right? Anyway. So another issue you might want to interrogate as well is the Department of Education. So one issue you might want to understand in an education system is that you've got a curriculum, right? So you've got what you call an intended curriculum, and you've got what you call a delivered or implemented curriculum, right? As well as an evaluated curriculum, which is a third step. But then you need to be able to understand that in most countries, in fact, you've got an intended curriculum. It's more like a perfectly competitive market, right? But then when the curriculum is implemented, or rather it's delivered, on a slightly poor scale. But the biggest challenge in South Africa is that I think it's the education system. The thing is, its objectives are quite flawed. Instead of taking the students to the standard, they bring the standard to the students. And that is the problem. So, in other words, you find that you've got a huge deviation between the intended curriculum and the delivered curriculum. I had a chat with an education specialist about 2 weeks ago, and they told me actually South Africa has got a very good curriculum. But of course, this was not backed by empirical evidence, so don't go and write it in your essay unless you've got evidence. But then the biggest issue is, you've got an intended curriculum, which is very good. But what is delivered is actually extremely poor, which is what we are talking about, changing from, what you call math literacy and all that kind of stuff. Math should be math. Math should be math, not math literacy and normal math. That's problematic. Yeah. So anyway, I think this I already mentioned. I already mentioned about the conclusion and recommendations. I think we will talk about this like next week in much greater detail. But of course, one thing I choose to do today is to clear some ambiguities. So I wish to find out from you guys, what questions do you have? And please be honest, say whatever you want to say. What don't you understand about the topic? I mean, I always say there's no wrong answer. It's always a correct answer to a wrong question, perhaps. You know, yeah. Okay, yes, we'll stop.
It doesn't have anything to do with the topic. It's actually two questions, but it's basically the same thing. I just want to find out, in terms of time frame when you're doing our research, is it absolutely necessary to look at apartheid, or can you like maybe look at post-apartheid?
Okay, so her question is when when looking at her paper, should she focus on before, rather during apartheid, right, and post-apartheid, right? Well, I mean, at the end of the day, you don't really have to spend a lot of time on that. All you just need is just to frame and identify where the problem came from. So you can actually attribute part of the problem to have come from apartheid, if not entirely, right? That's the kind of argument you want to structure. And post-apartheid, that's when the intervention came in. All right, the intervention to increase spending, in the education sector. So you don't really have to spend a lot of time. What we're more interested in is the challenges. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, and then when you're making your recommendations,
Yes.
in terms of time again, how far do you look at 5 years, 10 years, in terms of like the impact, are we looking at short-term impacts or long-term?
Okay, so the question she's asking here is when you're making recommendations, I mean, is it for the long term? Is it a quick fix or what? I mean, we would, in such an essay, we would welcome, a recommendation that's in between, not really a quick fix, but what fixes the problem, pretty much. So just outline what you think should be done. I mean, this is a second-year essay. We do not expect revolutionary recommendations, Yeah, I mean, that would be nice, though. I mean, given that this essay is being written for the budget speech competition, that would be nice. I mean, to have a revolutionary recommendation. But of course, it's just to show that you're able to think and engage with the material, and you're able to identify. Because I mean, one thing I choose to highlight is, I mean, already this should be ringing in your minds that in South Africa, the issue is not with resource allocation. Right? So it's not an issue with resource allocation. It's about efficiently using resources. That is what one of the biggest challenges is. So even your recommendations should also span around that. I mean, at the end of the day, for instance, I mean, when you talk of teacher absenteeism, right? I mean, how would you recommend that be addressed? Of course, I mean, one basic way would be to have better management, right? But I mean, how you motivate better management becomes your recommendation. Yeah. So it's not revolutionary, and it's not. You'll be fine. Yeah.
I'm interested in that question, like how factual and well thought, and well evidenced do our recommendations have to be? Like, do we have to have sources and things to back up the feasibility of our recommendations, or do we just have to put out ideas or opinions?
Well, look. You can put out opinions. I mean, it's sort of train smash. But I mean, I would like to believe most of your recommendations might even come from other papers. I foresee that. I mean, a lot of research has been done, especially on the education sector in South Africa. A lot of recommendations have been made. But of course, I mean, it doesn't hurt to add, your own thoughts and what you think the status quo should be. But most of the recommendations you're going to make probably have been made already. So it's not a train smash. Yes.
In terms of the government, the role of the government, is it possible to mention corruption? If so, how do you prove corruption could be in this case?
Okay. So one issue that here is highlighted as well in terms of government, would it be important to mention, the issue of corruption, right? The issue of corruption, and how would we prove? It's a very important point. How would we, prove corruption? I mean, it's a very good question. One way you would go about it is try and identify within the literature, I'm sure someone has identified within the literature on, scandals relating to books. I think there was a scandal in Limpopo regarding books. That's part of the corruption. I mean, how corruption, within the country ends up affecting, because I mean, one of the biggest challenges in Limpopo was students did not get their books on time. And how does that factor into how students perform? Can we just have a bit of silence and we'll be done soon? These questions are very important. Okay, I'll be with you in a bit. Yeah.
Slightly silly question, but isn't this more like the Macron's essay topic? I just want to know how it relates to mine.
So Thank you. So the question here is, this sounds more like a macroeconomic topic. Well, look, sometimes in certain topics, this is the economics of education. In certain topics, you find that there is actually a thin line between macroeconomics and microeconomics, because macroeconomics is actually built on microeconomic fundamentals. So in other words, when you're looking at the socio-economic factors of pupils, that's more or less in a microeconomic nature, all right? But when you're talking of policy analysis, regardless macroeconomics, it all sums up, it becomes an aggregate. Okay.
So do we have to use our textbook as a reference?
As long as it's fruitful information, well, yeah, it's not a problem. But if you don't use it, it's not a train smash. As long as you're applying the theory from your book, and if it's applicable. So don't force theories. If a theory does not apply, well, yeah. Some people would choose to look at, I mean, I would advise, if you have a chance, you know, maybe look at a book that talks about the economics of education. Maybe you might find one or two, you know, definitions or theories that support education and, you know, spending on education, etc., etc. Okay, I'll be with you.
Like when you're talking about the introduction, like you get,
So can you just have a bit of silence so we can get him?
when you're talking about like what we should talk about in the introduction, you mentioned quite a lot of different things, which would, if you all pack it into your intro, would make it quite long. So could you kind of split it up in some senses? So for instance, like when you said, when you talked about creating comparisons between South Africa and other countries, could you allude that you're going to make comparisons, but then later in your essay actually define what your comparison is?
Yes, yes. I think I had mentioned this earlier on. I said, well, I talked about a lot of things, you know, when I spoke about the introduction, of course. But, I mean, you can always put some of these issues in the main body. Because, like, I remember the time I was talking about someone writing 2 pages of an introduction. So we just want the introduction to be short, concise, and to the point. Then the remaining information can actually overlap into the main body, and you build your story there. Because remember, one thing, you know, in academic writing, it's not all about writing a piece. It's writing a coherent piece. Because remember, you know what you're thinking about. You know what you're thinking about. But putting what you're thinking about on paper are 2 different things. And I need to be able to decode whatever you've put on paper. And it has to be coherent and highly logical.
What would an appropriate size introduction then be?
A perfect introduction.
I mean, another size of an introduction.
Yeah, I think I did mention this as well, right? I said an introduction could be close to half a page. I mean, it would be nice. You can make it a whole page, but I mean, I'll get lost if I'm marking your essay. But half a page is good, concise and to the point. Yeah. Okay, I'll be with you. Yes, sir. Shh, guys, just these are very interesting questions. You will learn a lot by.
Talks about education standards and comparing that to other countries. Now are you looking at matric certification, or are you looking at the suitability of the pupils in the job market after school? What sort of standards are you looking at?
So that's a very interesting question. So the question is, when we looking at the standards of education. So are we looking at people, or, you know, perhaps people post, you know, school, etc., etc. So what we're actually looking at right now is a very important concept, which I choose not to define, is educational attainment. That is one standard you can use to make comparison. All right? So, I mean, I didn't want to define this because it's part of the essay task. So you can use education attainment as a standard, because education attainment simply means, I mean, I think I did speak about this earlier on, but I think I will choose not to talk about it. Yeah. So you can use education attainment to compare.
Looking at some matric type pass rate standard?
Yes.
That obvious kind of.
Well, that's one way to look at it. You can also, I mean, within your discussion, you can also factor in how matric students don't fare exceptionally well in university because of this. I mean, I'm giving you guys the answers literally, right? But you guys don't look happy at all. This is really sad. Anyway, yeah. Okay, thanks. Yes. Shh.
About comparing essay to its peers, like, and considering like the whole apartheid situation, like how do you? Zimbabwe obviously didn't go through apartheid, so like how do you sort of factor that into your comparison, like?
So yeah, that's a very interesting question. So Richard spoke about apartheid, you know, in South Africa, but Zimbabwe did not, you know, go through that. So what's important in this case is, remember, we're interrogating the theory of you know, the economics of education. And one thing we're trying to analyze here is, we generally, in a perfect competitive market, if you increase spending on education, we would expect access to education to increase. We would expect the quality of education to increase. So, of course, apartheid is a contributing factor towards, what has happened. Actually, apartheid brought about these inequalities. But how do you rectify for these inequalities? It's argued that by increasing spending, because these inequalities, are in the frame of people cannot go to school, or people were unable to go to school. But how do people go to school? You increase spending, right? You increase spending and make, create opportunity for all. But regardless of this, you create opportunity for all, and people, pupils go to school, but this does not transform into the quality you would expect for such spending. So this is a basic theory of education, right? You're spending, but nothing is happening. But what is wrong? That is the issue. And you've got countries, low-income countries, that are spending relatively small amounts. What could be the case? What are the differences? Did I answer your question? Convinced? Confused? Okay. I've seen a hand there. So that's a very interesting question. Should the essay be first person or third person? So standard writing is, we normally welcome third person. So even in your recommendations, please do not say I recommend. Say it is recommended, right? It is recommended, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Yeah. There's no I in an academic essay. In some institutions, well, yes, but in essays, in UCT and in particular School of Economics, we do not welcome the word I. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? Comments? Concerns? Okay, well, listen, if you guys have any questions, just drop me an email. Just drop me an email, and I normally respond to emails quite promptly. So, see you next week. And for those of you with questions, I'm in the front. Yeah.